Amara had always been invisible in the eyes of those who thought they knew her place in the world. A black woman in a store, dismissed, underestimated, and silenced by the very ones who held power over her. But when a racist manager accuses her of a crime she didn't commit, the world she's known fractures. What they don't realize is that beneath her calm exterior lies a truth that could shatter their perception and expose the lies that have kept her voiceless for so long. This is more than an arrest. It's the beginning of her reckoning. Before diving into this gripping tale, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more inspiring stories like this one. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words, a tense silence enveloping the small, cluttered store on the corner of the street. The outside world pulsed with life, horns honking, pedestrians bustling, the distant hum of a city that never rested. But inside, there was only the dull creak of floorboards and the soft whisper of old, cracked windows. This place, wedged between two towering buildings, seemed like a forgotten relic, a slice of history that had seen better days. Its shelves sagged under the weight of dusty cans and faded labels, and the dim, flickering light barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows across the rows of merchandise. In the back corner, behind the counter, stood Amara. She was tall, with striking features that held an unspoken strength. Her skin, a rich hue of deep brown, glistened faintly in the dim light, and her black hair was neatly pulled back into a tight bun. Her eyes, sharp and alert, surveyed the room with a mix of determination and weariness. Amara had learned long ago that nothing in this world was handed to you, and everything worth having was hard-earned. She had built this store from the ground up, after all, with nothing but sweat and the will to survive. The store was her sanctuary, her triumph, and yet today, it felt more like a prison. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, the motion automatic, and glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:42 p.m. Another slow afternoon. Most of the customers that wandered in were regulars, older folks who needed a loaf of bread or a carton of milk, a quick chat with Amara about the neighborhood. But today was different. There was an undercurrent in the air, a tension that had been building for weeks. The whispers had started around the neighborhood. Rumors about the new manager at the grocery store down the street, a man named Victor Hayes, whose reputation seemed to precede him. They said he was ruthless, that his attitude was cold and dismissive, and that he didn't care about the people who worked for him or the people who shopped there. Amara wasn't one to get involved in gossip, but as the weeks passed, she found herself wondering more and more about him. Was he just a typical corporate drone, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? She shook her head, brushing the thought away. She had enough on her plate. Rent was due, the store was barely making ends meet, and her mind kept drifting back to her mother, who had been sick for months now, her health deteriorating with each passing day. It was hard to keep up with everything, but Amara had always managed to hold it together, had always found a way to keep pushing forward. Just as she was about to check the inventory in the back, the bell above the door jingled, and Amara turned toward the sound. A tall figure stepped into the store, a man, mid-40s, wearing a crisp suit and tie, his face a mask of professionalism. His eyes immediately scanned the room, and Amara felt a flicker of unease. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a place like this. He looked out of place, too polished, too immaculate for a small corner store like hers. "Can I help you?" Amara asked, her voice steady but tinged with caution. The man paused, studying her with a look that lingered too long, as if assessing her every move. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. "Victor Hayes," he said, extending a hand. "I'm with the grocery store down the street. I'm looking for the owner." Amara didn't take his hand. Instead, she regarded him with a measured stare. She had heard enough about Victor Hayes to know what kind of man he was. His reputation was no secret, and from the moment he stepped in, she knew what kind of trouble he could bring. "I'm the owner," she said simply. Victor's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. There was something cold about it, a lack of warmth that set her on edge. "Amara," he said, as if tasting the name. I've heard a lot about you. Amara didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't one to be flattered by empty praise or shallow compliments. She had worked too hard for too long to be distracted by anyone who wasn't genuine. I'm sure you have, she said, her tone flat. Victor didn't seem put off by her lack of enthusiasm. He stepped further into the store, his gaze continuing to roam over the space as if he were inspecting it. He seemed to take particular interest in the shelves, his eyes flicking over the labels with a quick, clinical detachment. I see your store's been around for a while, he remarked, his voice casual, but Amara could sense the underlying judgment. But could use a little updating, don't you think? Some of these products, they're outdated. And the layout, well, it's a bit cramped, isn't it? She felt a surge of annoyance, but kept her composure. It's a small store. I've worked with what I have. Victor nodded, as if this were an answer he had expected. Well, that's admirable, he said, his voice almost patronizing now. But if you're interested in expanding, I have connections, resources, that could help you. Amara didn't trust him, not for a second. She had seen men, like him before, offering help that always came with strings attached. She wasn't interested in his so-called resources. I'm fine, she said curtly. Is there something you wanted? Victor's smile faded, replaced by a hard glint in his eyes. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Actually, yes. I wanted to discuss a little business matter. You see, I've been instructed by the owners of the grocery store down the street to offer you a deal. You've been operating on this corner for a long time, but we're looking to expand. I'm sure you understand the importance of that. Amara's stomach twisted at his words. She had heard rumors about the corporate takeover that was sweeping through the neighborhood, but hearing it from Victor's mouth made it all too real. This wasn't just a casual conversation. This was a threat. What kind of deal? She asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Victor's gaze sharpened, his eyes calculating. You won't have to worry about these shelves anymore. No more late nights or struggling to make ends meet. Just a nice, clean payout. Sounds good, doesn't it? Amara's lips tightened. The offer was cold, calculated. It wasn't the first time someone had come to her with such a proposal. They all thought she was just some small business owner, someone they could push around, someone they could take advantage of. But they didn't know her. They didn't know what she had built or what it meant to her. This store was more than just a place to make money. It was her mother's legacy, her sanctuary, her identity. It was the last thing that kept her connected to everything she had lost. No, thank you, she said firmly, her voice steady. Victor's eyebrows rose, his expression one of mild surprise. He had expected some resistance, but not this. Most people jumped at the chance to get out when the pressure mounted, to walk away from their troubles. But not Amara. She stood her ground, unwavering, as always. I see. You're a stubborn one, aren't you? He said with a slight chuckle, as though the rejection was amusing to him. That's fine. But understand this. You're going to be pushed out eventually. Whether it's by me or someone else. The day is coming when you won't be able to keep up with the changes. This neighborhood is changing, Amara. Your little corner store is a relic of the past. The future belongs to the big chains, the ones with the resources to compete. Amara's eyes narrowed. The audacity of him, standing there, acting as though he had the power to decide her fate. Her fingers tightened around the dish towel she still held in her hands, the fabric beginning to crease under the pressure. She didn't need to be told about the changes in the neighborhood. She had seen it herself. The area was gentrifying, the rent was going up, and soon enough, her store would be priced out. But this wasn't the way she was going to lose it. Not like this. I'm not interested in your deal, she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. Victor's expression shifted slightly, the mask of politeness slipping for just a moment. There was a flicker of something darker in his eyes, frustration, perhaps, or something more menacing. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same smooth, detached smile. Well, I can't say I didn't try, he said, stepping back and turning toward the door. But remember, Amara, the offer stands. You'll regret turning it down. As the door swung shut behind him, Amara stood frozen, her heart racing in her chest. Her fingers slowly relaxed around the towel, and she let out a shaky breath. She hated dealing with people like Victor, the kind of people who saw the world as a game to be won, with others as mere pieces to be moved around at will. But what truly unsettled her was the feeling that he wasn't the only one. There were more of them out there, more who saw her and everything she had built as a potential obstacle to their success. The bell above the door jingled again, pulling her back to the present, and she glanced up to see a woman step inside. This woman was different from the usual customers. Her posture was stiff, her face hard and guarded. She was tall, with short, cropped hair, dressed in a leather jacket and dark jeans. Her eyes swept the store with a quiet assessment before settling on Amara. "Hi," the woman said, her voice low but clear. "I'm looking for something specific. Do you have any herbal teas?" Amara blinked, a bit taken aback by the suddenness of the woman's presence. She hadn't expected anyone else to come in so soon after Victor, especially not someone like her. She wasn't sure why, but there was something about the woman that made her feel on edge, a sense of quiet danger that seemed to radiate from her. "We have a small selection," Amara replied, gesturing toward the back aisle. "It's in the third row. I can help you find it if you'd like." The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll find it," she said, her voice still calm, but tinged with an undercurrent of tension. She walked past Amara, not sparing another glance in her direction, and disappeared down the aisle. Amara watched her for a moment, a sense of unease creeping over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the woman wasn't just looking for tea. But what could she want in a store like this? It was just a small corner shop. Her instincts told her to keep an eye on the woman, but she tried to shake it off. She had other things to focus on. She needed to check the delivery for the week, stock the shelves, make sure the store was ready for the evening rush. But the strange woman wouldn't leave her mind. Amara's hands faltered as she began organizing the counter, her thoughts racing. Something about the way the woman had looked at her, the way she moved through the store, there was an edge to her, like she was hiding something. As if on cue, the woman returned, a box of herbal tea in hand. She approached the counter and placed it down with a soft thud, her eyes meeting Amara's for the first time. There was a moment of quiet between them, the tension hanging thick in the air. "I'm sorry," the woman said, breaking the silence. "I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable. It's just, I've been hearing a lot about your store lately." Amara raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "Hearing about my store? From who?" The woman hesitated for a brief moment before responding. "From people in the neighborhood. From people who have seen what's been happening here. You've been getting some attention. Good attention. People are noticing what you're doing with this place. But that attention comes with its own complications." Amara's pulse quickened. She could feel it. There was something this woman wasn't telling her. Something important. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low, barely above a whisper. The woman glanced around the store, her eyes flicking nervously to the door before returning to Amara. "Let's just say that there are forces at work here that want to see you gone. Forces that will stop at nothing to take this store from you. You're not just up against a big chain. You're up against something much darker." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and foreboding. Amara's heart raced, the weight of the woman's words sinking deep into her chest. She had known, deep down, that Victor's offer wasn't the end of it. But this was something else entirely. Something she hadn't prepared for. Her thoughts churned, a storm of questions and doubts flooding her mind. Who was this woman? What did she know? And most importantly, what was the real danger that was lurking, just out of sight? As the woman turned to leave, she paused at the door, glancing back at Amara one last time. "Be careful, Amara," she said, her voice barely audible. "And don't trust anyone, not even those who seem to offer you help." And with that, she was gone, leaving Amara standing alone, a storm of uncertainty raging inside her. The following day, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow across the city streets. The store, which had seemed so familiar to Amara only hours ago, now felt like a cage, one with walls closing in on her slowly, silently. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, the weight of it pressing down on her chest with every breath. The woman who had come the day before kept haunting her thoughts, her cryptic warning repeating in Amara's mind like an unshakable echo. Don't trust anyone, not even those who offer you help. But Amara had no choice. She had to keep pushing forward, keep the doors open. If she let fear take over, she'd lose everything. The bell above the door jingled again, pulling Amara from her thoughts. She glanced up, expecting the usual customer, a neighbor stopping by for a quick errand, but what she saw instead made her freeze. Victor Hayes stood in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. His eyes were dark, cold, and he wore a face that seemed more like a mask than anything else. The polite smile from yesterday was gone, replaced by something harder, something that spoke of power, control, and an underlying menace. Amara, he said, his voice even, but with a certain edge to it that made her stomach tighten. We need to talk. She felt the muscles in her back tense, instinctively bracing herself for whatever was to come. He had come back, but it wasn't for another friendly conversation about buyouts. This time, she could tell, something was different. The tension in the air was palpable, and the way he stepped further into the store made her uneasy. I'm busy, she said curtly, wiping her hands on her apron as she took a step back, moving toward the counter. Victor didn't seem fazed by her resistance. He moved closer to her, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the wooden floor. I'm afraid I can't let you keep ignoring me, Amara. There's something important we need to discuss. Amara crossed her arms, locking eyes with him. I already told you. I'm not interested in your offer. I've made myself clear. Victor's gaze never wavered, but there was a flicker of frustration behind his eyes, a brief moment of impatience that quickly masked itself behind his carefully constructed exterior. It's not just about the offer anymore, Amara. It's about what happens next. Her heart skipped a beat, and the air seemed to grow colder. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, the feeling of impending doom wrapping itself around her like a tightening noose. What do you mean by that? She asked, her voice low, guarded. Victor's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm giving you one last chance to walk away from all of this. You don't want to make an enemy out of me. Before Amara could respond, the store door swung open with a force that rattled the frame. A man burst inside, his eyes wild with panic. His clothes were disheveled, his face pale, as though he had just run a marathon. He was breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his forehead. Amara, he shouted, his voice shaking. You need to get out of here. Now. Amara's mind raced. She didn't recognize the man, but something in his voice, something urgent, told her that this was no ordinary customer. Victor's expression darkened, and he stepped forward, blocking the man's path with a subtle but firm gesture. What's going on here? He demanded, his voice laced with authority. The man's eyes darted between Victor and Amara, his panic escalating. There's something happening. They're coming for you. Amara's heart stopped. Who's coming for me? She asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. The man swallowed hard, his throat dry, as he tried to find the words. The people from the bank. They've sent someone to take the store. I overheard them talking. They're using someone inside the neighborhood to force you out. They're making a move today, and it's going to happen fast. Amara felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. She had suspected that something was going on. Victor's offer hadn't been just a simple business transaction, but hearing it confirmed like this felt like a punch to the gut. There was no room for doubt anymore. Her worst fears were coming true, and she was standing at the center of a storm she hadn't even seen coming. Victor, however, didn't seem to react the way she expected. Instead of showing any sign of surprise or concern, he merely glanced at the man with a cold, calculating gaze. You're lying, he said, his voice low and menacing. You don't know what you're talking about. The man's expression faltered for a second, but he held his ground. I'm not lying. I'm trying to warn her. They've got people planted in this neighborhood. You're not just fighting against the big chains anymore. It's bigger than that. They've been watching you for weeks. Amara's mind reeled as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The whispers she had heard in the neighborhood, the strange woman who had come into the store yesterday with her cryptic warning, the tension in the air that had been building for weeks. She had thought it was just the pressure of running the store alone, but now she realized the truth. It was more than that. She wasn't just fighting to keep her business afloat. She was fighting against a larger, more dangerous force. Victor was still standing there, unmoving, his face an unreadable mask. "I think it's time for you to leave," he said to the man, his tone final. The man opened his mouth to argue, but Victor took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'll have you removed if you don't leave this moment. Don't think I won't." Amara's breath caught in her throat as she watched the man back down, looking between them in fear before fleeing out the door. The moment he was gone, Victor turned back to Amara, his smile returning, though it was colder, more sinister than before. "You heard the man," Victor said quietly. "You're out of time, Amara. I gave you an offer. I tried to help. But now, I'll do what it takes to take you down. This place is done. You can't stop what's coming." Her heart was pounding in her chest, her thoughts scattered as she processed the weight of his words. The store was done. She had always known that the world was changing, that the small businesses like hers didn't stand a chance against the big corporations. But she had never thought it would happen like this. Not with the silent threat of betrayal hanging over her head, not with people pulling the strings behind the scenes. "Leave," Amara said, her voice shaking, but there was a fire in her eyes now, a resolve that hadn't been there before. "You don't get to tell me when this store is done. I'll fight for it, and you will not take it from me." Victor chuckled, a sound without humor. "We'll see about that." As he turned and left the store, Amara was left standing there, the weight of the threat settling heavily in her chest. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and fears, but one thing was certain. The fight was only beginning. Amara stood behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped down the already pristine surface. Her mind was a mess. Fragments of thoughts collided in every direction, but they all circled back to one terrifying conclusion. She had just made an enemy of the wrong person. Victor Hayes wasn't just a businessman. He was a predator, and she had walked straight into his trap. His cold, detached demeanor, combined with his subtle yet persistent threats, had rattled her more than she cared to admit. But it was the man who had come to warn her that had truly unsettled her. Her thoughts kept drifting back to his frantic warnings, the raw panic in his voice. "They're coming for you." What did he mean by that? Who were they? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this whole situation than she could see. The store was quieter now, the usual hum of activity replaced with a tense stillness. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly in the silence, a constant reminder that time was running out. Amara couldn't afford to lose focus. She needed to keep the doors open, keep the business running. That was her only priority. Everything else felt secondary now. But the pressure was mounting. She could feel it in the way people looked at her, in the subtle shift of the air whenever she stepped outside. It was as if the walls of the small store were closing in, every corner a reminder of the danger she was facing. She needed to do something, but what? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the door opening. She looked up to see Zayed stepping inside. He was her cousin, though they hadn't spoken much in the past few years. Zayed had always been a bit of a wild card, unpredictable, prone to impulsive decisions, but he was family. And family meant something to Amara, even when it wasn't easy. "Hey," he said, offering a half-hearted smile. "I brought you some coffee." Amara didn't return the smile. "Thanks, Zayed," she said quietly, taking the cup from him and setting it down on the counter. "I needed that." Zayed's gaze softened, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind." She didn't know whether she should tell him everything. She didn't even know if she could trust him. Her mind kept telling her that she had to keep her guard up, that there was too much at stake now. The stakes had always been high, but now it felt like everything she had worked for was teetering on the edge. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just a little tired, you know? Running the store by myself has been a lot." Zayed raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You've been running this store for years, Amara. I don't think it's just about being tired." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "What's really going on?" Amara hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. Could she really confide in him? Would he understand? Or would he just think she was overreacting? The last thing she needed was to be dismissed, to feel even more alone in all of this. "It's Victor," she said finally, her voice low. "He's not just trying to buy me out. He's doing something else. Something more dangerous." Zayed looked at her sharply, his eyes narrowing in concern. "What do you mean? What's he doing?" Amara glanced around the store, as if expecting someone to be eavesdropping. "I don't know everything yet, but I know he's connected to the bank. And I'm pretty sure he's got people inside the neighborhood watching me." Zayed didn't speak at first. His expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for something that wasn't there. Then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Amara, you know how these things work. You can't fight this alone. You're not just up against Victor. You're up against a whole system. And systems don't care about small businesses. They crush them." Her heart tightened at his words. She had always known that running this store was never going to be easy. The world was changing, and businesses like hers were increasingly becoming the target of corporate greed and ambition. But to hear Zayed, someone who had always been pragmatic, if not somewhat cynical, speak like this made her feel small, insignificant. The reality of the situation was sinking in. "Then what do I do?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly as a wave of helplessness washed over her. Zayed paused for a long moment, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't know, but you can't just sit here and wait for them to take everything from you." Amara's stomach churned at the thought. Everything. The store. The legacy her family had built. All of it could be gone in an instant if she didn't act. But how could she fight back? She wasn't some big shot CEO. She didn't have the resources or the power that Victor did. She was just one woman, trying to keep her head above water in a world that didn't care if she sank or swam. "I'm not giving up," she said firmly, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. But she had to believe it. If she didn't, she would lose everything. Zayed studied her for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "All right, but you're going to need help. And you're going to have to trust people, even when it's hard." Amara flinched at the last part of his sentence, a sharp pang of fear piercing her chest. Trust. That was the last thing she could afford to do right now. She had already trusted people, trusted Victor, and look where that had gotten her. She had no idea who she could trust anymore. But as Zayed turned to leave, he paused at the door and glanced back over his shoulder. "I'll be here, Amara. You don't have to do this alone." She nodded, watching him leave with a sinking feeling in her stomach. Trusting people wasn't just about opening up, it was about risking everything. And right now, Amara didn't know if she was ready for that. The bell above the door jingled again as Zayed left, but Amara didn't feel the relief she had expected. Instead, the store felt colder, emptier. The weight of her situation pressed down on her, suffocating her. And the more she thought about it, the more the feeling of betrayal gnawed at her. It wasn't just Victor. It was everyone who had ever promised her that things would get better, that hard work would pay off. It felt like everyone had a hidden agenda, their motives concealed behind smiles and handshakes. Suddenly, the door opened again, and a figure stepped inside. Amara looked up, heart skipping a beat, and for a brief moment, she thought it might be Victor. But it wasn't. Instead, a woman entered, tall, elegant, with an air of quiet confidence that seemed to command attention the moment she stepped into the store. Amara didn't recognize her, but there was something oddly familiar about the woman. She was dressed in an impeccable suit, her face framed by dark, wavy hair that cascaded down her shoulders. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was something in the way she carried herself. Something unsettling, that made Amara feel like she was standing in front of a storm. The woman's gaze met Amara's, and for a split second, their eyes locked. There was no word spoken, but the tension was palpable, thick with unspoken understanding. Amara swallowed hard, unsure of what to say, unsure of what this new person wanted. Was this another one of Victor's people, or someone else entirely? "Can I help you?" Amara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, I'm here to help you, Amara, or at least to offer you a choice." The hairs on the back of Amara's neck stood up. This was it, the moment where everything changed. The day had started like any other. Amara opened the store at dawn, wiping down counters, stacking the shelves with precision. The familiar sounds of the creaky door, the dull hum of the lights, and the steady tick of the old grandfather clock were almost comforting. Yet today, a sense of unease settled over her like a thick fog, lingering even after the first few customers had arrived, one by one. Her mind kept drifting back to the woman who had entered the store yesterday, her unnervingly calm demeanor, her cryptic words that had left Amara more confused than ever. "I'm here to help you, Amara, or at least, to offer you a choice." Those words repeated in her mind like a broken record. A choice. What choice could she possibly be offered now? Who was this woman? And why did she feel like a pawn in someone else's game? The truth was, Amara was caught in a web, one she hadn't spun herself. It was a web woven by Victor Hayes, the ruthless businessman who had already made it clear that he would stop at nothing to take control of her store. But this new woman, she was a wild card, a player Amara hadn't accounted for, and Amara wasn't sure she liked the idea of not knowing all the players. But that wasn't what had her truly rattled. It was the letter. A letter had arrived just after Zayed left, a simple envelope with no return address, its contents sealed with the kind of finality that made her pulse race. She had held it in her hands for a moment, staring at the handwriting, as though it might offer some clue as to who had sent it. But when she opened it, there were only a few words, written in stark, jag handwriting that seemed to scrawl across the page. "We know about your past, Amara. You cannot run from it. The truth will catch up to you." The words made her blood run cold. The truth will catch up to you. What truth? What did they know? Her stomach churned as she reread the letter, wondering if someone had figured out what she had been trying to bury for years. Was it Victor? Was he trying to use her past against her? Or was it someone else? Someone from a different chapter of her life? A chapter she had long since closed? She folded the letter, slipping it into the drawer beneath the counter, but it didn't erase the feeling of dread. It lingered. Every shadow in the store, every whisper of movement, felt like a warning. "Amara." The voice brought her back to reality, and she turned to find Zayed standing in the doorway, his face drawn with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, walking toward her, his eyes scanning her face for answers. Amara didn't say anything at first, but he could tell something was off. It's nothing. Just a little tired," she replied, offering a weak smile. But Zayed wasn't buying it. "Amara, talk to me. You've been on edge for days now. Is it about Victor? Or something else?" She shook her head. "It's more than just Victor," she admitted, feeling the weight of the secret pressing against her chest. "I got this letter today, Zayed, and it's not just about the store. It's about something from my past, something I thought I'd left behind." Zayed's expression shifted, his concern deepening. "What are you talking about?" Amara hesitated. She hadn't told him everything about her past, about the choices she had made, the mistakes she had tried to outrun, the things she had done out of desperation when she had no other choice. Would he still stand by her if he knew the full truth? Or would he see her as the person she feared she was? "I'm not sure," she said quietly, "but I think whoever sent that letter knows about it. They know about me, about what I did." Zayed's brow furrowed, but instead of pushing her for answers, he nodded. "We'll figure out. But don't keep this to yourself, Amara. Whatever it is, we face it together. That's what family's for." Amara felt a surge of gratitude for him, but at the same time, an overwhelming guilt gnawed at her. She hadn't told him everything, and she wasn't sure she could. There were some things that once said couldn't be unsaid. Some truths that once revealed would change everything. "I'll think about it," she said, trying to push away the heavy weight of her thoughts. "But for now, I have to keep going. I can't let Victor win. Not now. Not when we're this close." Zayed gave her a small, reassuring smile, but Amara could see the worry in his eyes. "You're stronger than you think, Amara. But remember, this is bigger than just the store. It's bigger than Victor. You're in the middle of something you don't fully understand. Just be careful." Before Amara could respond, the bell above the door jingled again, signaling another customer's arrival. Zayed gave her a brief nod before stepping outside, leaving Amara alone with her thoughts once again. The store felt quieter now, and as Amara turned back to the counter, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single envelope, placed carefully on the counter, its edges crisp, the handwriting unmistakable. It was the same jagged handwriting as the letter. Her heart skipped a beat as she reached for the envelope, her fingers trembling. She tore it open quickly, hoping it was some kind of mistake. But as she read the words, her blood ran cold. "You thought you could outrun the past, Amara. You thought you could hide, but there's no escaping who you really are. We're coming for you. And this time, no one will be able to protect you." The words felt like a slap, each one landing with the weight of 1,000 truths she had tried so hard to bury. "We're coming for you." She had no time to process it before she heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a scraping noise coming from the back of the store. It was faint, but enough to make her jump. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she moved cautiously toward the source of the sound. Was it someone from Victor's side? Was it the woman who had promised to help her? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone from her past, someone she had never expected show up again? Her hand brushed against the door to the back office, her breath catching in her throat. There was a strange, unsettling feeling in the air. Something was wrong. She pushed the door open slowly, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. Everything appeared to be in order, but the feeling of unease only deepened. She was about to turn back when she noticed a piece of paper on the desk, half hidden beneath a pile of receipts. It was another envelope, this one more worn and torn at the edges, the name Amara written in bold black ink. With a mixture of dread and curiosity, Amara reached for the letter and tore it open, her hands shaking with anticipation. The letter inside was brief, but the words felt like a punch to the gut. "It's not Victor you need to worry about. He's just the distraction. The real danger is much closer than you think. Watch your back." Her stomach dropped. The real danger is much closer than you think. Who could it be? Who else was involved? And why was everyone so determined to bring her down? Amara's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. The stakes had just been raised. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about survival. As she closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts, the answer hit her like a freight train. It wasn't just Victor. It was Zayed. Her heart clenched. Zayed. No, it couldn't be. He had always been there for her. But now, the pieces of the puzzle were coming together in a way she hadn't expected. His sudden appearance at the store yesterday, his cryptic warning. Could it be that Zayed was involved in all of this? Had he been playing her from the start? Her body went cold at the thought, and for the first time, Amara felt completely and utterly alone. The tension within Amara's chest continued to tighten, and she could feel it growing more unbearable with every passing minute. Her thoughts kept spiraling, and each new revelation only served to deepen the mystery surrounding her. The letter, Zayed's cryptic warning, the sudden appearance of that woman, everything was starting to unravel in ways that were too dangerous to ignore. She had barely processed the haunting words of the letter when a knock at the front door of the store echoed through the stillness. Amara's breath caught in her throat, and she froze, her mind racing. The knock was too deliberate to be coincidental. No one ever knocked like that. 3 sharp raps, one after the other, like a countdown. Her heart skipped a beat as she approached the door cautiously, her footsteps muted on the hardwood floor. She couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching her, that something or someone was closing in on her. But who? With a deep breath, Amara turned the key and cracked the door open slightly, just enough to peer outside. There was no one standing there. The sidewalk was empty. The quiet hum of the street was the only sound. But then, she noticed it. A small, folded piece of paper resting against the doormat. Her hand shook as she bent down to pick up. The ink on the paper was fresh, the message short, but heavy with menace. "You're being played, Amara. Zayed isn't who you think he is." Her throat tightened, and she clutched the note in her hand, staring at it in disbelief. Zayed. No, this couldn't be happening. It didn't make sense. Zayed had been there for her when no one else was. He had helped her through the darkest days, and the idea that he could be part of this conspiracy, of this web of deceit, was too much for her to process. She felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. Could it be true? Could Zayed be working with Victor, or was he part of something far more sinister? The voice of reason in her mind whispered that she couldn't jump to conclusions. She couldn't let herself be swept up by fear and paranoia. But the letter kept staring back at her, and in the pit of her stomach, a cold dread began to form. There was no denying that things were spiraling, and the more she tried to control the situation, the more it slipped from her grasp. Amara crumpled the letter in her fist and stuffed it into her pocket. She needed answers. She couldn't keep running in circles, not when the stakes were this high. Turning away from the door, she heard footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. She spun around, but to her surprise, it wasn't Zayed, who had been absent for most of the morning. It was the woman from yesterday. Her eyes narrowed as the woman entered, her steps calm and assured. There was no sign of the usual anxiety in her demeanor, no hint of the vulnerability she had shown the day before. If anything, she seemed stronger, more self-assured. "You're here again," Amara said, her voice a mix of confusion and suspicion. The woman didn't answer right away. She glanced around the store, seemingly unaffected by Amara's tension. Finally, she met her gaze, and this time, there was no trace of uncertainty in her expression. "I warned you," she said. "You don't know who you're dealing with, but you're starting to figure out, aren't you?" Amara felt her heart pound as she took a step back. She had no time for games. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why are you involved in all of this? What is it you're trying to tell me?" The woman sighed, a deep, almost regretful exhale. "You've been living in the dark for far too long, Amara. It's time to let the light in. You've been blind to the truth, but now it's too late to back out." Amara's hands clenched into fists, her emotions a whirlwind of anger and confusion. "What truth? What are you talking about?" she snapped. The woman's eyes flicked to the back of the store, to the small office where Amara had found the letters earlier. A silent understanding passed between them, and the woman nodded. "You don't understand what's at stake. You think you're just fighting for your store, your future, but you're fighting for so much more. For your life, for your very identity." Amara's blood ran cold at the mention of her identity. She had kept it hidden for so long, hoping that the past would stay buried, that no one would dig into the life she had left behind. But this woman, whoever she was, seemed to know things that no one else could have known. "I don't know who you think you are," Amara said, struggling to keep her voice steady, "but you have no idea what you're getting into. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of anything." The woman raised an eyebrow, almost as if she were amused. "You should be. You have no idea who you're really up against. You're not just up against Victor. You're up against something much bigger than that." Before Amara could respond, the sound of the front door opening made her freeze. She turned, expecting to see Zayed, but instead, it was someone else, someone she hadn't seen in years. A tall man, dressed in a sharp black suit, stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Amara. There was a cold, calculating look in his gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "I wondered when you show up." Amara's throat tightened. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice almost a whisper. The man smirked. "You don't remember me, do you? It's been a long time, Amara, but I remember you." Her mind raced, her heart hammering against her chest. There was something about him, something familiar, yet she couldn't place it. She didn't have time to think about it, though. Her gut told her this was it. The moment everything changed. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've been running from the past for too long," he continued, his voice cold and steady. "It's time to face what you've been hiding." Amara's breath caught in her throat as she realized who he was. The name floated to the surface of her mind like a ghost she'd buried long ago. Dante. Her pulse quickened, her mind struggling to reconcile the person standing before her with the memories she had tried to forget. Dante was a part of her past, someone she had thought was long gone. But here he was, standing in front of her, the embodiment of everything she had tried to escape. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. Not now. "You thought you could escape, Amara," Dante said, his voice low and menacing. "But it was never going to be that easy." The woman who had been watching quietly finally spoke up, her voice calm but heavy with significance. "She can't run anymore, Dante. She's already caught in the web." The tension in the room grew thick, suffocating. Amara could feel the walls closing in on her, and the more she tried to make sense of the situation, the more it all seemed to slip through her fingers. Dante stepped closer, his face now inches from hers. "You can't hide who you are. You'll never outrun the past, Amara. It's time to face the consequences of your actions." Her mind spun, but her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp sound, the unmistakable crack of a phone ringing. Amara's heart stopped as the woman glanced at her phone, her eyes narrowing. "It's time," the woman said, turning to leave. As Dante watched her go, he turned back to Amara with a dark smile. "You think this is just about your store? You think you're fighting for something that matters? You're fighting for your life." The finality in his words hit Amara like a freight train. The room spun, and she barely registered the sound of the door slamming shut behind her. There was no escape anymore. She was trapped in the middle of a storm she hadn't seen coming, and there was only one way out. Face the truth. And survive. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as the weight of the moment settled over her like a thick fog. Her mind was racing, desperately trying to piece together the fragments of the puzzle that had eluded her for so long. The cryptic letters, the mysterious woman, the sudden reappearance of Dante, everything was coming to a head now, and she could feel the walls closing in. The past she had worked so hard to bury was clawing its way back to the surface, and there was nowhere left to hide. She stood in the center of her store, the once safe haven, now tainted with secrets she couldn't outrun. The walls, lined with dusty shelves and the faint scent of incense, seemed to close in around her. It was as though the very air was charged with a palpable tension, thick and heavy, making it harder to breathe with each passing second. Outside, the world was unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the threshold, but Amara couldn't ignore it anymore. There was no more time to play games. No more time to question what was real and what was part of the tangled web she'd been caught in. The door to the store opened with a creak, pulling her out of her thoughts. Her stomach churned, and she instinctively stepped back, her eyes darting toward the entrance. There, silhouetted in the dim light of the street lamp, stood Zayed. He was dressed in dark, somber clothing, his face a mask of determination but with an unmistakable hint of guilt. It was the look of a man who knew he had failed someone, of a man who had been caught between two worlds and was about to pay the price. Amara's pulse quickened as she watched him step inside, his eyes locking with hers. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't seem to find the right words. She couldn't even tell if she was angry or relieved to see him. Zayed's eyes softened as he approached, his voice barely above a whisper. "Amara, I never wanted this to happen. I didn't want you to get involved in all of this, but it was always going to be a matter of time." Amara clenched her fists at her sides. "What is going on, Zayed?" she demanded, her voice breaking with emotion. "What have you got me into? I thought you were my friend, but now everything is falling apart and I have no idea who I can trust." He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. His next words were laced with regret, each one heavy with the weight of a truth he knew would shatter her. Amara, I didn't want to betray you, but there are things you don't understand, things you couldn't possibly know. Then make me understand, she shouted, her voice raw with frustration. Tell me, Zayed, who are you really? What is all of this? Why did you let me believe you were someone you weren't? Zayed's gaze faltered, his shoulders slumping as he stepped closer to her. His voice dropped to a near whisper. I didn't have a choice. It was never about you, Amara. It was about something much bigger than both of us. The words hit her like a slap to the face. She could feel her breath hitching in her chest, a cold dread creeping into her veins. Bigger than us, she repeated, her voice trembling with disbelief. What does that even mean? He sighed, his hand reaching out as if he were trying to comfort her, but she stepped back, unwilling to let him get any closer. Amara, I've been part of something that goes back years. The people you've been trusting, the ones you think are your allies, they're not who they say they are, and neither am I. Amara's mind was spinning, the words cutting through her like shards of glass. Her heart sank, and she could barely breathe. All of this, everything she had worked so hard to build, was a lie? Before she could say anything, the door slammed open, and the woman, the one who had first warned her about Victor, strode into the room. She looked as cold and unflinching as ever, her eyes scanning the room with sharp precision. Behind her, Dante appeared, his presence like a shadow hanging over the entire room. There was no escaping now. The trap had been set. The woman's eyes flicked from Zayed to Amara, and she spoke in a voice that was steady but laced with a sense of finality. You've both been living in the dark for too long. It's time to see the truth. Dante smirked, stepping forward with an air of superiority. It's all connected, Amara. All of it. The letters, the store, your past. It's part of a much larger game. And you've been a pawn all along. Amara felt a chill wash over her stomach twisting with the realization that everything she had thought she knew was nothing but a facade. Her voice barely came out as a whisper. A pawn? What do you mean? What game? Zayed stepped forward, his face etched with regret, but his eyes no longer held the warmth she had once trusted. You were never meant to find out, Amara, but you got too close. You wanted to protect what wasn't yours to protect. What are you talking about? She cried out. What's mine, Zayed? What am I even fighting for anymore? The woman's lips curled into a cold smile. You're fighting for the truth. The truth about who you really are, about what you were meant to be. Amara felt the ground shift beneath her, the room spinning as her entire world seemed to collapse in on itself. What truth? What am I supposed to be? She asked, her voice breaking. What is this? What do you want from me? Dante took a step forward, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. The truth is that you are the key, Amara. You always have been. Everything, the letters, the store, even Victor, was always leading to this moment. You're part of something bigger, and you can't escape it, no matter how hard you try. Amara's legs felt weak, her body shaking with the weight of his words. She wanted to deny it, to scream at him that he was lying. But deep down, a sickening feeling in her gut told her it was true. She had been part of this game from the very beginning, and now there was no going back. The woman stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. You have a choice, Amara, she said, her voice cold and calculating. You can walk away from this now, but you'll never be free. Or you can stay, and you can take control. You can use the power you've always had, the power they've been hiding from you. Zayed's face tightened. You don't have to do this, Amara, he said, his voice strained. You can still walk away. You don't have to be part of this. But Amara already knew. She knew there was no walking away. The truth was too big, too overwhelming to ignore. It had always been inside her, buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And now, with everything laid bare, she had no choice but to confront it. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, meeting their gazes with newfound resolve. I'm done being controlled, she said, her voice steady but full of determination. I'm done being a pawn. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Amara's words hung in the air, the weight of them settling like a stone. This was the moment of truth, the point where everything would change. And Amara knew deep down that no matter what happened next, she would no longer be the same person. The weight of the words hung in the air like a shroud, pressing down on Amara's chest with each passing second. Her mind was a whirlwind, every thought colliding with the next. The truth she had just uncovered felt like a heavy stone lodged deep within her, one that she could not ignore, no matter how much she wished she could. Her heart ached, a gnawing emptiness where once there was certainty. She had thought she knew who she was, what her life meant. But now, with every revelation, every betrayal, that foundation seemed to crumble beneath her feet. And yet, there was no escaping it. The world she had tried so hard to keep separated from her own had engulfed her entirely. Amara stood in the midst of the storm, the tumult of emotions inside her threatening to pull her under. Zayed's eyes were still fixed on her, full of something she couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Was it guilt? Or was it a kind of resignation that mirrored her own? There was no time to dwell on it, no time to wonder what had brought them here. The truth had been laid bare, and now she had a choice. To accept her place in the larger scheme, to wield the power that had always been hers, or to walk away and leave everything behind. But the very idea of walking away, of retreating into the comfort of ignorance, fell hollow. There was no peace in that path, no resolution. The woman, the one who had pulled the strings from the shadows, had offered her a choice, a dangerous, intoxicating choice, to embrace the power within her, to take control of her fate. But could she really trust it? Could she trust the people who had orchestrated this entire game, only to lay it out before her like some twisted offering? Amara's breath caught in her throat as she turned away from Zayed and the woman. She couldn't look at them anymore, couldn't allow herself to be swayed by their words, their promises. There was something deep within her, a spark of defiance, that refused to let her be defined by them. She walked to the window, the glass cool beneath her fingertips, and stared out into the night. The city stretched out before her, its lights twinkling like a field of stars. It felt distant, unreal, like something she had once known but no longer understood. How had she gotten here? How had everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in, become so tangled with lies and manipulation? Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, and for the first time, she didn't recognize the woman staring at her. Was this who she had become? A puppet in a game of deceit, caught between two opposing forces, with nothing but her own broken trust to hold on to. But as the thoughts swirled in her mind, something shifted within her. The emptiness in her chest began to fade, replaced by something else, something stronger, a quiet, steady resolve. She wasn't going to let this be her end. She wasn't going to let the darkness consume her. Turning back to face the others, Amara squared her shoulders and spoke, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm done," she said, her words cutting through the silence. "I'm done being a part of this. I'm done being a pawn in a game that's not mine." Zayed's face twitched, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. "You can't walk away from this, Amara," he said, his voice laced with a mix of frustration and desperation. "You have no idea what you're walking into." "I know exactly what I'm walking into," she replied, her gaze hardening. "I'm walking into my own future, my own life, not some puppet master's game." The woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand, Amara. You can't just walk away. Not now. Not after everything." Amara shook her head, her resolve firm. "You've been using me. All of you. You thought you could control me, manipulate me into doing what you wanted. But I won't let you. I won't be a part of this anymore. You may have the power, but I have the choice." A long silence followed her declaration, one that stretched uncomfortably between them. Amara could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down. But she didn't flinch. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back now. The woman's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You think you have a choice?" she asked, her voice tinged with mockery. "You think you can just walk away and leave all of this behind?" "I don't think I have a choice. I know I do," Amara said, her voice a calm declaration of independence. "You can keep your power, your secrets, your twisted little game. But I'm not playing anymore." Zayed's expression darkened, but he didn't argue. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. Perhaps guilt, perhaps admiration, but also a kind of helplessness. He knew, deep down, that she was right. She had made her choice, and there was nothing they could do to stop her now. The woman took a step back, her gaze flicking to Dante, who had been silently watching the exchange from the shadows. Dante said nothing, but the air seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension. They had underestimated her. They had thought that by unveiling the truth, they could force her into submission. But Amara had proven them wrong. She turned away from them and walked to the door, her heart beating with purpose, with clarity. As her hand touched the doorknob, she paused for a moment and glanced back over her shoulder. "Goodbye," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet strength. "You won't see me again." With that, she stepped out into the night, the cool air embracing her as she walked away from everything that had once defined her. The store, the people, the lies, they were all behind her now. She was no longer a pawn in their game. She was free. But even as she stepped into the unknown, Amara knew that her journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As she disappeared into the darkness, the city stretched out before her, vast and open, full of possibilities. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. For the first time in a long time, Amara felt like she was finally in control. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.